She didn't look at me the way most people do. Most people look through me. That's not self-pity. That's just the truth of what it means to wear a work shirt with your name stitched above the pocket. You become part of the furniture. You become the guy who fixes the thing and leaves. I've been doing that for 11 years now. 11 years of crawling under kitchen sinks and climbing into attics that smell like insulation and old wood. 11 years of driving a beat-up white van with Hargrove Plumbing and Repair on the side, which is just my name, which is just me, which has always just been me and my daughter, Ren. Ren is 8. She has her mother's eyes, which I notice every single morning when she's eating her cereal and not looking at me, and I have to decide again, quietly, to be okay with that. Her mother left when Ren was 2. There isn't a villain in that story, or if there is, it isn't the kind worth telling. What matters is that it's been the two of us since then, me and Ren, in a rental house in Clarksburg, Maryland, with a landlord who takes 2 weeks to respond to emails and a furnace that needs persuading every November. That's the life. That's the whole of it, and I want you to understand that I wasn't unhappy. I was tired sometimes. I was lonely in the particular way that single parents get lonely, which isn't the same as being alone. It's more like being surrounded by everything you love and still feeling the empty chair. But I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't walking around with a hole in my chest waiting to be filled. I was just living. And then one Tuesday in March, I got a service call in Potomac. Potomac is a different world. I know that sounds like something people say, but I mean it practically. The driveways are longer. The garages have better lighting than my kitchen. You pull up to a house like that and you check the address twice because it doesn't seem possible that one family needs that much roof. The call was routine. A burst pipe in the basement, secondary water heater showing a fault code. I'd done 100 of those. I rang the bell and a woman answered the door who looked like she had been in the middle of something important and had been in the middle of something important her entire life. Her name was Marlowe. Marlowe Ashford. I didn't know who she was then. I found out later, the way you find things out when you type someone's name into a search bar because you can't stop thinking about them. She was the founder and CEO of a logistics company called Ashford Meridian that did something with supply chain software that I still don't fully understand, except that it was worth somewhere north of $800 million, and she had been named to a Forbes list twice and donated enough to a children's hospital in Bethesda that they put her name on a wing. None of that was visible when she opened the door. What was visible was that she was exhausted and trying very hard not to show it, and that behind her, at the kitchen island, there was a little boy sitting with his chin in his hands, staring at nothing. She said my name from the work order. "Mr. Hargrove?" I said, "Yes, ma'am. Just Neal is fine." She stepped back to let me in and said the basement door was through the kitchen, and as I walked past the island, the little boy looked up at me, and I nodded at him the way I nod at kids, which is like nodding at a person because they are. He didn't nod back. He just watched me until I was past him, and then I heard the scrape of his stool and the small sound of his socks on the tile as he followed me to the top of the basement stairs. His name was Eli. He was 6, and those are the 2 facts that reorganized my entire life, though I didn't know it yet. I worked for about 40 minutes in that basement. It was straightforward enough once I got into it. I could hear Marlowe on a phone call somewhere above me, her voice controlled and precise, in a way that sounded like practice. At some point I realized the light near the stairs was blocked, and I looked up and Eli was sitting on the 3rd step from the top. Watching me work, I said, "Hey, bud." He didn't say anything. I said, "You want to hand me that wrench, the silver one, right there on the tarp." He looked at the wrench. He looked at me. He came down 3 more steps, picked it up carefully with both hands, and held it out. I said, "Perfect. Thank you." He went back to his step. I don't know how to explain what that exchange was exactly. It wasn't remarkable. It was a 6-year-old handing a grown man a tool. But there was something in the way he did it, the deliberateness, the absolute focus, that stayed with me. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't performing helpfulness for his mother. She wasn't even in the room. He just decided to help because I needed the wrench, and so he got it. Kids who aren't talking are still saying things. You just have to be paying attention. When I came back upstairs, Marlowe was off the phone. She paid me, and she asked how long the repair would hold, and I told her honestly, which is that the secondary unit was aging, and she'd be smarter to replace it before next winter than wait for another fault. She wrote that down. Actually wrote it on paper, which surprised me for some reason. At the door, I said, "He's a good helper, your son." Something moved across her face that I couldn't quite read. She said, "He doesn't usually do that." I said, "Do what?" She said, "Interact with people he doesn't know." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said, "Well, he's got good instincts." She looked at me for a moment like I'd said something in a language she almost spoke. Then she thanked me again, and I went back to my van, and I sat there for a minute before I started the engine. I'm not sure why I sat there. I just did. I didn't think I'd go back. I had no reason to go back. 6 weeks later, she called the office number and asked if I could come assess the water heater replacement, and I told my assistant I'd take it myself, which wasn't unusual, except that it was. Ren was with my mother that Saturday. I drove out to Potomac with the windows down and the radio on some station playing old Springsteen, and I told myself I was just doing a job. Marlowe answered the door again. She was in jeans this time, which somehow surprised me more than anything else about her. She looked like a person. She led me to the utility room and asked smart questions about BTU capacity and venting requirements, and I answered them. And at some point, Eli appeared in the doorway of the utility room and sat down on the floor with a book. He didn't look up from the book. He just existed near us. Marlowe and I talked for maybe an hour. About the water heater, mostly, and then less about the water heater, and more about the house, and then a little about the neighborhood, and then she made coffee without asking if I wanted any, and set a mug on the counter near where I was standing, and I drank it. I found out that her husband had died 4 years ago. Cardiac event, sudden, no warning. He was 41. She'd been running the company and the house and Eli more or less on her own since then, with help from a woman named Bet who came 3 days a week, and from a sister in Chicago who visited when she could. I didn't tell her about Ren's mother that day. I don't know why. It didn't feel like the right shape of conversation yet. What I did was finish my assessment, leave her a written estimate, and shake her hand at the door, and notice that she held the handshake for about half a second longer than a business handshake usually runs. Eli was back at the kitchen island. On my way out, I stopped and said, "Good book?" He looked up. He held the cover toward me. It was a field guide to North American birds. I said, "You see a lot of birds out here?" He nodded. "Just once, very seriously," I said. "My daughter likes the cardinals. We put a feeder outside our kitchen window and she counts them." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he pointed past me, out the window above the sink, at a large oak tree in the side yard. I turned and looked. Sitting on one of the upper branches was a red-tailed hawk, absolutely still, looking at nothing. I said, "Huh." Eli made a sound. It was barely a sound. It was somewhere between a breath and a word. And what it sounded like, if I had to transcribe it, was, "He comes every day." I turned back and looked at him. He was already looking at the book again. I went home that evening and I told Ren about the hawk and she said, "Was it big?" And I said, "Very big," and she said, "Did it see you?" And I said, "I don't think so." And she thought about this seriously and said, "Hawks see everything, Dad." And I thought about a little boy in a big house watching a hawk out a window every day by himself, and something in my chest did something I wasn't prepared for. Marlowe called me 3 weeks after that. Not the office number. My cell, which I had given her on the estimate form. She said there was a problem with the basement sump pump and she was sorry to bother me on a Sunday. I was grocery shopping with Ren. I said it was no bother. I went the next morning. Eli was at school. Marlowe was home because she'd moved a call to accommodate me, which she mentioned in passing, and then immediately said she hadn't rearranged anything on my account, which was the kind of thing a person says when they're being slightly dishonest with themselves. I fixed the sump pump. We had coffee again. She asked about my work, the actual origin of it, how I'd gotten into plumbing and repair. And I'd told her the truth, which was that I'd started apprenticing at 19 because I needed money, and I'd stayed because I was good at it, and I liked fixing things that were broken. She listened the way some people listen, which is like they're actually interested in what you're saying, and not just waiting for their turn. I told her about Ren. She told me more about Eli. He was in a program, a specialized school for kids with selective mutism, which is not the same as shyness, she explained carefully, like she'd explained it many times and was used to people misunderstanding. He had language. He understood everything. He just stopped in certain conditions, like a circuit breaker tripping. He'd been mostly nonverbal at school for 2 years. She said it with a flatness that told me exactly how many nights that flatness had cost her. I said, "Does he talk at home?" She said, "Sometimes, more lately. His therapist says he's made real progress." I said, "He talked to me, a little, about the hawk." She looked at me over her mug. She said, "I know. He told you?" She said, "He said, the man knows about cardinals." We sat there for a moment. I said, "Well, I know a little about cardinals." She smiled. I don't know how to tell you what that smile was like without making it sound like something out of a movie, but it was the kind of smile that someone produces when they have been very careful for a very long time, and they just, for one moment, forgot to be careful. This went on for a while. That's the honest description of it. It went on for a while in the way that things go on when two people are orbiting each other, and neither of them wants to be the first one to say what it is. I found reasons to drive out to Potomac. She found reasons to call. The water heater got installed. A door that stuck needed adjusting. A ceiling fan needed replacing. Wren came with me once, on a Saturday, and she and Eli sat at the kitchen island doing a puzzle while Marlowe and I worked, side by side, cutting crown molding, which I want you to understand is not a metaphor. We were just cutting crown molding. But we kept bumping elbows and neither of us moved. Wren said on the way home, "I like Eli. He's quiet, but he knows stuff." I said, "What kind of stuff?" She said, "Bird stuff. He told me the cardinal outside is a male because of the red. The females are brown. Did you know that?" I said I did know that. She said, "He told me with his hands, mostly." But I understood him. I thought about that for most of the drive home. What I want to tell you, because I think it matters, is what happened at the benefit. Marlowe's company sponsored a fundraiser for a children's literacy nonprofit in April. One of those events at a hotel ballroom in downtown Bethesda. Tables of 10. Centerpieces that probably cost more than my monthly truck payment. She had a table. She mentioned it twice before she actually asked me, and both times she walked it back before she got to the question, and the third time she asked if I wanted to come as her guest. I said yes before she finished the sentence. I borrowed a blazer from my brother-in-law. I got a haircut. Wren inspected me before I left and said I looked nice and then said, "Is it a date?" And I said I wasn't sure. And she said, "Dad," in the tone of an 8-year-old who has seen enough to know the answer. And I said I'd be home by midnight. I was out of place at that table. That's not insecurity talking, that's geometry. The other guests were a venture capitalist, a city council member, 2 physicians, and a woman who apparently ran a nonprofit that Marlowe's company had funded for years. They were all perfectly pleasant. They just moved through rooms like those rooms had always been built for them. I talked to a man named Preston who had a lot to say about interest rates and looked a little surprised when I held up my end of the conversation. I talked to one of the doctors about a plumbing renovation I'd done in a medical office building in Rockville. I ate the salmon. I drank 1 glass of wine because I was driving. But mostly I watched Marlowe work the room, which is different from watching someone at a party. She knew every person there by name. She remembered their kids' ages, their professional victories, their causes. She moved through that ballroom like she had spent years learning its language, and she had, because she had built everything she had from the inside out, after losing the person she'd built it with. At some point she came back to the table and sat next to me and said, "I'm sorry, these things always run longer than they should." And I said I didn't mind, and I meant it. She said, "You look uncomfortable." I said, "I look fine." She said, "You look fine. You seem uncomfortable." I said, "I'm not uncomfortable. I just know I'm the only person here who owns a pipe wrench." She laughed, really laughed. The couple across the table looked over and smiled, because laughter is contagious even when you don't know what it's for. She leaned just slightly toward me and said quietly, "For what it's worth, you're also the only person here who I can actually talk to." I didn't say anything to that. I just looked at her. And she looked back, and we sat like that for maybe 5 seconds, which is a very long time when you're sitting like that. I drove home thinking about what I was doing. That's the honest version of it. I drove home on 495 thinking about the gap between her world and mine, which was not about money the way people think it's about money. It was about fit. About whether I belonged anywhere near her life, or whether I was just the guy who came to fix things and stayed too long. I almost didn't call her again. I went about 2 weeks where I made myself busy and answered her texts promptly but neutrally, the way you answered texts when you're trying to create distance without being dishonest about it. She noticed. She's a person who notices things. She texted me one afternoon. Eli asked when you were coming back, just passing it along. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time. Then I called instead of texted, which felt important, and when she picked up I said, I think I've been pulling back and I don't actually want to be doing that. There was a pause. She said, I know. I said, I don't know how to do this. I fix things for a living. I know how to find the problem and solve it. This doesn't have a problem to find. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Neal. I said, yeah. She said, just come over. I came over on a Saturday. Ren was at my mother's again. I drove out to Potomac without Springsteen this time, without the radio at all, just the sound of the road. Eli opened the door. I don't know who was more surprised, him or me. He looked at me with that serious expression he had, the one that felt like being assessed by someone very old in a very small body. Then he stepped back to let me in. Marlowe was in the kitchen. She looked up and said something about coffee, and then she didn't say anything else because Eli walked past her to the hall closet and came back with his field guide and his jacket. He stood in front of me and held out the book. I said, You want to go outside? He put on his jacket. We went out to the backyard. Marlowe followed, and for about an hour the three of us walked around the yard and the small wooded edge of it, and Eli pointed at things, and sometimes told me what they were, and sometimes just pointed. A black-capped chickadee on the fence. Deer tracks in the soft earth near the tree line. The red-tailed hawk, which did come like Eli said it would, and settled into the high branches of the oak like it had an appointment. Eli stood next to me looking up at it. I looked up at it too, he said. He doesn't let most people see him, I said. Why do you think that is? He thought about it very carefully. Then he said, Maybe he only comes close when he knows you won't chase him away. I looked down at him. He was still looking at the hawk. Marlowe was a little behind us. I didn't look at her. I just stood there next to Eli, looking up at the hawk, and I felt something settle in me that had been unsettled for a long time. I want to tell you about the moment I knew, because I think it's important to be specific about these things, and because the moment was not what you'd expect. It was 3 weeks later, a Tuesday evening. I'd come over after work, still in my work shirt, and Marlowe was finishing a call in her office, and Eli was in the kitchen doing his homework. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink and looked for something to do, and ended up helping Eli with a worksheet on fractions, which he understood perfectly well, but which he'd decided were beneath him. We sat at the island for about 20 minutes. He worked the problems in pencil, very neatly. I looked at his work and said right or said try that one again, and he erased without complaint. Ren called me on my cell and I talked to her for a few minutes about something that had happened at school, a conflict with a friend that required delicate navigation, and I talked her through it and told her I loved her and hung up. Eli said, without looking up from his worksheet, She misses you. I said, Yeah, she does. I'll be home soon. He said, Does she know about us? And by us he meant himself and his mother and me. And the fact that he said us like that, like it was already a thing with a name, like it was already a category that existed in the world. I had to look away for a second. I said, She knows. She likes you. He said, She told me Cardinals mate for life. I said, She's been doing some reading. He went back to his fractions, and I sat there at that island in my work shirt, with grease probably still under my fingernails, and I thought, this is it. This is the one. Not the feeling, not the romance of it, the rightness of it, the fit. Marlowe and I talked about everything eventually, the way you do when you finally stop performing caution and just sit with someone in the actual light. We talked about what we wanted, which was hard for me because I hadn't let myself want things in a while. We talked about what our kids needed. We talked about money, which was awkward in the way it's always awkward when the gap is real, and she said something that I've thought about 100 times since. Neal, I have never once in my life needed someone to take care of me financially. What I need is someone who shows up. You show up. I said, I fix things. She said, I know. That's what I mean. I brought Ren out on a Sunday in June. She and Eli spent most of the morning in the backyard with the field guide. I made lunch. Marlowe sat at the counter, watching me move around her kitchen, and she said, You know where everything is. And I said, I put the dish soap under the left side of the sink, remember? And she said, I know, I've been leaving it there ever since. After lunch, the kids went back outside. Marlowe and I sat at the table with the door open so we could see them through the screen. Wren was pointing at something in the oak tree. Eli was talking, actually talking, in sentences, explaining something, and Wren was nodding like she understood, and maybe she did. She's a kid who understands more than she lets on, which is something she gets from me. Marlowe had her hand on the table between us. I put mine next to hers. She said, Neal. I said, yeah. She didn't say anything else. She just turned her hand over, and I took it. I've been asked since then by people who know the story how it happened, how the math of it works. Man with a pipe wrench, woman with a company worth the better part of $1 billion. 2 kids from 2 different losses, sitting in an oak tree yard in Potomac talking about birds. I don't know how to answer that, except honestly. I wasn't looking for anything. I was just doing my job, and I looked at a kid the way you look at a person, which is to say I looked at him all the way, without deciding in advance what I was going to see. And he saw that I was doing it. And he remembered. That's the thing about being seen. You can't fake it, and you can't manufacture it. You either look or you don't. And when someone looks at you, really looks, without wanting anything back, you remember it. You remember it the way you remember the cardinal on the feeder, the hawk in the high branches, the things that could leave at any moment and chose, for reasons of their own, to stay. Who is the person in your life who saw you, not who should have, not who you wished had? Who did? The one who looked at you when you weren't worth much on paper and found something there anyway. Have you ever told them? Because here is what I know now, on the other side of it, sitting in a house in Potomac on Sunday mornings, while Wren counts birds and Eli points at things in the oak, and Marlowe makes the kind of coffee that takes longer to make, and I have no idea how she does it. And I've stopped asking because I think that's part of the gift. The realest thing one person can do for another costs nothing. It doesn't require a certain income or a certain address or a name on a Forbes list or a name stitched above a pocket. It just requires looking, fully, without flinching, without agenda. And if you have someone in your life who did that for you, and you haven't told them yet, tonight, tell them tonight. I'll see you in the next one.